Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating review from the Open Volume. We're looking at a deeply ambitious book by the late Norman L. Geisler called 12 Points That Show Christianity is True, a handbook on defending the Christian faith. Now, if you know 20th-century evangelical apologetics, you know Geisler. He was a massively prolific voice. And this handbook, it's basically his attempt to map out faith using pure step-by-step logic. Let's get right into it. So, this brings us to the central hook of our explainer today. Think about this. Is it actually possible to engineer certainty? Like, can you start from absolute ground zero and logically prove the existence of a theistic God, the reliability of the New Testament, the deity of Christ, and the authority of the Bible without just relying on blind faith? Well, Geisler argues that yes, you absolutely can.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to start with the blueprint of apologetics, look at how to build the logical staircase, examine the strongest steps, identify the cracks in the foundation, and finally, get to the final verdict. All right, Section 1, the blueprint of apologetics, mapping Geisler's 12-point chain. So Geisler is really targeting the uncertainty we see in our modern, super crowded religious marketplace. To prove Christianity is rationally compelling, he leans on a method called Thomistic-evidentialist apologetics. That's a mouthful, I know. But basically, instead of demanding you just presuppose the Bible is true right from the jump, he relies on natural theology, historical evidence, and formal logic. He's really following in the footsteps of heavy hitters like Thomas Aquinas and C.S. Lewis here. And this idea beautifully illustrates the core architecture of the entire book. Geisler describes his argument as a staircase. It's 12 distinct propositions. And the whole idea is that you literally cannot skip a step. Every single proposition builds directly on the conclusions of the one that came right before it, taking you all the way from the ground floor of basic human knowledge right up to biblical inerrancy. It's structurally pretty impressive. Moving on to Section 2, building the logical staircase, focusing on the 4 major movements.
Those 12 points divide pretty naturally into 4 major movements. First up, he establishes epistemological foundations. That's basically proving we can know truth at all. Second, he moves into philosophical theology, arguing for the existence of God and, the possibility of miracles. Third is historical apologetics, zooming in on the New Testament and Jesus. And the fourth and final movement transitions from Christology to bibliology, so moving from the idea of Jesus being God to the Bible being the Word of God.
Now, take a look at how Geisler builds that very first step. He argues that denying truth and logic is, it's completely self-defeating. If a skeptic says, we cannot know anything about reality, think about it. They just made a firm knowledge claim about reality, right? And if someone tries to deny the law of non-contradiction, they actually have to use the law of non-contradiction just to make their point. It's a bit of a logical trap. Geisler actually uses this logic to great effect against claims that we can just transcend logic entirely, like the ideas you might sometimes find in Zen Buddhism. He says that refusing to make truth claims is, deep down, just another truth claim. This is a really clever move because it effectively frames the entire handbook not as some rigid demand for belief, but as a shared exercise in undeniable rational inquiry. Okay, Section 3, the strongest steps. Let's evaluate the book's key strengths.
So, according to the reviewer in the Open Volume, where does this logical staircase actually hold the most weight? Well, one of the absolute standout moments is Geisler's takedown of the philosopher David Hume. Hume essentially argued that wise people should proportion their belief to how frequently something is observed, so to him, miracles were incredibly unlikely. But Geisler brilliantly points out that this logic kind of proves way too much. If we only believe what happens frequently, we'd have to reject the Big Bang or the origin of first life. Those are singular events that even naturalistic scientists completely accept. It's a really solid counterpunch.
Another massive strength of this book is its historical apologetics, which the reviewer calls the linchpin of the whole argument. Geisler points to 5,800 Greek manuscripts to support the historical reliability of the New Testament. I mean, that's a staggering amount of standard manuscript evidence and patristic citation data he brings to the table here. And it gets even more granular than that. Check out this number, 82. Geisler lists 82 specific historical, geographical, and cultural details just in the Book of Acts alone that have been independently confirmed by archaeology and history. The reviewer explicitly notes this is a true moment of awe and evidentiary accumulation. It's concrete, it's specific, and it's incredibly useful data for anyone having a serious conversation about history. So, to sum up the reviewer's praise, the book's absolute greatest strengths are the structural transparency of that 12-step chain, his really excellent philosophical work against Hume, that substantive New Testament data we just talked about, and his broad engagement with competing worldviews. He doesn't just argue against some generic, vague idea of God. He maps out atheism, pantheism, and Islam, which gives readers a super solid taxonomy of the intellectual terrain out there.
Which brings us to Section 4, Cracks in the Foundation. Let's look impartially at the reviewer's critiques and the book's limitations.
Because, let's be honest, no building is without its flaws. The reviewer argues that the weakest joint in the entire staircase is actually the very final transition. Geisler makes a pretty big leap here. He argues that because Jesus affirms specific Old Testament text, we must therefore accept the very specific modern Chicago statement on biblical inerrancy. The reviewer points out a major inferential gap here. Making that jump requires the reader to just accept a bunch of unargued premises about how inspiration actually works. And it's worth noting that this specific leap lands very differently depending on your own theological tradition. Reformed and evangelical readers, they're generally going to love this approach. It fits right in. However, from a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox perspective, Geisler's final steps kind of bypass their traditions entirely. By relying on purely rational inference from an individual reading a text, the book completely misses the role of the church, tradition, and the magisterium, things that those faiths hold as co-constitutive of biblical authority. Another major crack the reviewer identifies is the book's somewhat insular quality. Because it relies super heavily on older sources and, honestly, often substitutes quotes from famous converts instead of providing direct philosophical engagement, it misses some of the strongest contemporary objections out there. There's really no engagement with the textual critiques of Bart Ehrman, the historical methods of N.T. Wright, the famous neo-atheist critics like Dawkins or Hitchens, or even modern Muslim apologetic scholarship. Section 5, the final verdict. Who is this handbook actually for? Taking into account these really impressive strengths and the notable weaknesses we just covered, who should be picking this up? Well, the reviewer heavily recommends it for pastors who need a brief, logically structured summary of classical apologetics. It's also absolutely perfect for lay apologists or small group leaders who are actively having conversations with skeptics, undergraduate students who are brand new to this kind of cumulative case building, and recent Christians who just want a solid, rational framework to map out their faith. Conversely, you should probably look elsewhere if you want deep, cutting-edge engagement with modern analytical philosophy of religion. Also, if you belong to a Catholic, Orthodox, or Anglican tradition that relies heavily on a tradition-based framework, this specific logical staircase might feel a bit incomplete to you. And finally, advanced students and scholars needing engagement with critical, modern New Testament scholarship on its own terms will likely find this handbook just a little too brief.
So, the final rating from the open volume is recommended. But, and this is a vital caveat, it should be treated exactly as what it is. It's a highly accessible, incredibly well-organized primer and reference handbook. It's not meant to be a definitive, exhaustive philosophical treatise. But if you follow Geisler's steps, you will, at the very least, completely understand how the puzzle pieces of classical Christian apologetics fit together. I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on today. Geisler certainly proves that you can build a formidable 12-step logical staircase. But is a logical staircase truly enough to reach absolute certainty in our modern age of skepticism? Or does the true foundation of belief ultimately require something more than just pure rational inference? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking those big questions.